Welcome back guys, today we start the Cold War topic. In this video we're exploring the origins of the Cold War, looking at the Grand Alliance, the two superpowers and mutual suspicion. Let's jump in. The origins of the Cold War is really the story of how the USA and the USSR went from allies to enemies. We will explore how these conferences like Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam led to these tensions rising between these two superpowers, and how nuclear weapon development also increased tensions. We will also explore the term sphere of influence and how this played a role in increasing tensions as well. Another important term we'll dive into is mutual suspicion. But to begin today's lesson, we're going to jump back to 1941. When the USA entered World War II in 1941, the Grand Alliance was formed between the USA, Britain and the USSR. This alliance was fighting against the Axis powers of Germany, Japan and Italy. This Grand Alliance meets for the first time at the Potsdam Conference of 1943, where they discuss plans on how to defeat the Nazis and also plans for Europe after the end of World War II. One of the main agreements was that the Grand Alliance would open a second front against the Nazis. In reality, what this means is attacking the Nazis from the west. So the USA and Britain agreed they would invade Nazi-occupied France. It was also agreed that once the Nazis were defeated, the USSR would join the USA and Britain in their war against Japan, one of the Axis powers. Another agreement at Tehran to note was that Poland's borders were moved westwards and the USSR gained some new territory in the east. And at this conference we see the birth of this idea of a sphere of influence, not just for the USSR, but for both West and East. It was agreed that the Western powers would be in charge of a sphere of influence over Western Europe, a capitalist sphere of influence, while the USSR would have their own communist sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. There were some signs of tension at this conference. The USSR wanted to punish Germany with reparation payments. However, the USA and Britain were less keen to do this. They wanted to rebuild Germany because they were fearful of further tension as seen after the Treaty of Versailles, when Germans reacted very angrily and bitterly towards their punishment. The next major conference to know about is the Yalta Conference in 1945, at the end of World War II. At the Yalta Conference, the big three, Britain, USA and the USSR, plus France, all agree to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. So the USA has a zone, Britain has a zone, France has a zone, and the USSR has a zone. The German capital, Berlin, is also divided in the same way. Berlin is a key source of tension through the Cold War, and you'll find this out in later videos. It was also agreed at Yalta that there would be free democratic elections for those countries previously occupied by the Nazis. This promise was not upheld by Stalin, as he believed his sphere of influence gave him political control over Eastern European countries. But more on this later. Also at Yalta, we see the boundaries of Poland being officially drawn up and agreed, and we see the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi war criminals are decided to be put on trial and face punishment. Similarly, after World War I, when we had the League of Nations, we see after World War II this theme reoccurring of war prevention and international cooperation, and from this we get the United Nations. The idea of the United Nations had been discussed in depth at Yalta. The final conference we're going to explore is Potsdam in 1945. The Potsdam Conference confirmed many of the details of the agreements of Yalta. However, there were also some separate ideas being discussed at Potsdam that you need to know about. But firstly, some important context here. Following Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman was now the president of the US, and he was suspicious of the USSR. Now the US had successfully detonated a nuclear weapon shortly before Potsdam. This was kept a secret from the USSR, However, Stalin actually knew about these plans due to his spy network. At Potsdam, Stalin brought up the fact that he was being withheld information from the US. He viewed their nuclear weapon tests and the fact they hid it from the USSR as a threat. And now we're seeing these tensions rising between the USA and the USSR. At this time, Stalin also created a communist government to govern Poland, which Britain and the US felt went against their promises made at earlier conferences. Remember, it was agreed at Yalta there would be free democratic elections for those countries previously under Nazi occupation. This included Poland. However, the USSR believed their sphere of influence gave them the power to govern Poland. So now we've been through the conferences, let's just take a second and step out at the bigger picture and look at what are the new ideologies of these two superpowers. After the end of World War II, the USA and the USSR were clearly the two superpowers of the world. They both had the most political, economic and military influence on the world stage. However, they were very different in terms of their political ideology, and they were suspicious of one another. This is why the term mutual suspicion is used often. They were both so concerned with each other because they believed the other one was a threat to their national security and peace. So we have communism under the USSR and capitalism under the USA. So under the USSR's version of communism, we have some core beliefs and values. The USSR has state control of industry and agriculture under their communist states. They have one political party, which means no free democratic elections. They believe in world revolution, which means replacing these capitalist nations with a communist system. And they have strong censorship of the media. Now you can see the capitalist system of the US is very different. They believe in private enterprise, so not state ownership. They believe in political freedom, so several political parties and free democratic elections. There's also much less censorship and more freedom of speech. It was not just about capitalism and communism. A major cause of increasing tensions between the two superpowers was the threat of nuclear weapons. This is seen after the end of World War II, when the US drops not one, but 2 atomic bombs on Japan. After Germany surrendered, another Axis power, Japan, continues to fight. And so in August 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. President Truman refuses to allow the USSR to take part in the occupation of Japan. And remember, the building of these bombs was kept a secret from the USSR. So because of this, the USSR becomes more suspicious of the USA and their plans for the world. For 4 years, the USA was the only nuclear power on planet Earth. This boosted their international status and power massively. And the USSR saw this as a threat. And so this begins an arms race, where the USA and the USSR are competing against one another to build larger and more sophisticated and deadly nuclear weapons. Another factor increasing tensions at this time is Soviet expansion. The USSR used their army, called the Red Army, to install communist puppet governments across Eastern Europe. This included Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. And of course, the West views this communist expansion as a serious threat to their interests. Despite these massive tensions between these two superpowers, there's no direct fighting between the two sides, hence the name Cold War. In 1946, Winston Churchill gives a famous speech where he refers to the Iron Curtain, this political, military, and ideological barrier separating East and West during this period. So by the time this speech took place in 1946, it's very clear that the USA and the USSR are no longer allies. They're now threats to one another. And this is how the Cold War began. There are 2 famous telegrams in 1946 that you should know about, because these telegrams are great evidence of increasing tensions in the early Cold War. The first telegram is the Long Telegram of February 1946. This was a telegram issued to President Truman, which stated that Stalin had implied in his speech he wanted to destroy capitalism. The telegram also warned the USSR was trying to weaken and divide the West, while also building up its own military. The other telegram is the Novikov telegram of September 1946. This is issued to Stalin. It states that the USA wanted world supremacy and was trying to limit the USSR's sphere of influence. After these telegrams are issued, Truman and Stalin are now both on high alert, and this mutual suspicion has been exacerbated further. Truman feared the spread of communism because after World War II, Western Europe was in economic decline, and this increased the threat of communist takeover. And so in response to this threat, Truman introduces two new initiatives. The first is the Truman Doctrine of March 1947. This is a pledge to support any nation threatened by communism. The support could be diplomatic, financial, or military support. Under this doctrine, $400 million was given to Turkey and Greece. The other initiative is the Marshall Plan of June 1947. This plan gave $17 billion of aid to European countries who were struggling economically following the end of World War II. Western-occupied Germany benefited massively from this plan. Stalin forbade Eastern European nations from taking part in this plan. He viewed the Marshall Plan as a way for the West to lure Eastern European countries away from communism and towards capitalism. In response, Stalin brings in two initiatives of his own. The first is Cominform in 1947. This brought all of the communist parties in Eastern Europe together under one clear ideology, under the control of the USSR. In 1949, we get Comecon. This was the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. This was an attempt to counter the Marshall Plan by improving the economies of those nations in the East. This plan nationalized industries, collectivized agriculture, and gave economic aid to those countries who were struggling. Now it's time for those GCSE History tutor key points to get you that top band answer in your exam. The defeat of Germany in World War II served as a catalyst to the Cold War, by transforming the United States and the USSR into two world superpowers with different political ideologies. This sets the foundations for an ideological and political rivalry based on mutual suspicion and distrust. Post-war tensions were intensified by a sequence of global events that brought to an end the isolationist policies of the US, drawing them into a proxy war over power in Europe. Both superpowers introduced new initiatives to try and contain the threat of one another. For example, President Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine in March 1947 as a policy of containing the spread of communism by pledging economic aid to countries threatened by communist takeover. These policies, mostly introduced due to fear and suspicion, set a precedent for 45 years of tension, a nuclear arms race, and a constant threat of nuclear war between the East and the West. Now let's go over some common exam questions that refer to the origins of the Cold War. A short question might be, explain two consequences of the Tehran Conference. You may like to refer to any rising tensions from this conference, for example, disagreements over Germany. So you could talk about the reparations that Stalin wanted compared to the rebuilding of Germany's economy that the Western allies wanted because of the Treaty of Versailles and the reaction to that in 1919. And then for a second consequence, you can talk about the sphere of influences, the Western capitalist sphere and the Eastern communist sphere, and how this was discussed at Tehran. And you may as well mention what long-term effects this had on increasing tensions between the two superpowers. A longer question may be, explain how the development of the atomic bomb was important for the development of the Cold War. So your answer needs to go along the lines of the US keeping secrets from the USSR through their development of the atomic bomb. This was mentioned at Potsdam by Stalin. And you could also talk about Japan and the US landing these bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and what impact this had on worsening relations between the USA and the USSR. The other long question here is the same structure of question, but just a different factor. It says, explain why the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe was important for the development of the Cold War. So this is where you can talk about Soviet sphere of influence and the communist governments set up in Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and countries like these. And it would be great if you can mention Churchill's Iron Curtain speech and how this reinforced the idea of a political, military, and ideological barrier between the communist East and the capitalist West. And this brings us to the end of the origins of the Cold War. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.